The fluorescent lights of the community college hallway flickered as Daniel Park pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the practice room door. Inside, a student fumbled through a basic scale exercise, each wrong note like a knife twist in his chest. 3 years ago, he had walked these same halls as the most promising violinist the school had ever seen. Now he was invisible, just another face in the crowd of night shift janitors mopping floors that once echoed with his own virtuoso performances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel moved his cleaning cart past the trophy case where his photograph still hung. Best Soloist, Regional Competition, 2021. The young man in that picture wore a confident smile and held his violin like it was an extension of his soul. That Daniel Park seemed like a stranger now. The current Daniel had calloused hands from scrubbing toilets, not from pressing strings against a fingerboard. His clothes smelled like industrial cleaner instead of rosin and wood polish. His eyes carried the weight of shame that came from spectacular failure witnessed by everyone who had once believed in him. The music building was supposed to be empty at this hour. Most students had gone home for the evening, their practice sessions complete, their futures still bright and unblemished. Daniel preferred it this way. Working the night shift meant he could avoid the stares and whispered comments from former classmates who still attended during the day. It meant he did not have to explain what had happened, why the golden boy had fallen so far, why he wore a janitor's uniform instead of concert blacks. Daniel pushed his cart toward the main rehearsal hall, the largest performance space on campus. This room held 1,000 seats and had acoustics so perfect that every note resonated with crystalline clarity. He had performed his senior recital on that stage, just 3 months before everything collapsed. The memory of that night still burned in his mind with painful vividness. He had been preparing for auditions at the Berklee College of Music, one of the most prestigious conservatories in the country. His teachers had assured him that acceptance was practically guaranteed. Scouts had already heard him play at competitions. His future had been mapped out with absolute certainty. Then came the callback audition, the final step before acceptance. Daniel had prepared for months, practicing 8 hours every day until his fingers bled. He had chosen the most technically demanding piece in the violin repertoire, Paganini's Caprice No. 24. It was a showpiece designed to demonstrate virtuosity, a composition so difficult that even professional violinists approached it with trepidation. Daniel had been confident, perhaps too confident. He had wanted to prove that he was not just good, but extraordinary. The audition had started well. The opening passages had flowed from his violin with precision and power. The panel of judges had leaned forward in their seats, clearly impressed. Daniel had felt the familiar rush of performance adrenaline, that electric sensation of being completely in control of his instrument and the room. Then, in the middle of the most technically complex passage, something had gone catastrophically wrong. His left hand had cramped without warning, the fingers seizing up in the middle of a rapid position shift. The music had stopped abruptly, replaced by a discordant screech as his bow scraped across the strings in the wrong place. Daniel had tried to recover, had attempted to push through the cramp and continue playing. But the damage was done. His concentration was shattered, his confidence destroyed. The rest of the audition had been a disaster, filled with missed notes, poor intonation, and rhythmic inconsistencies. When he had finished, the silence from the judges had been deafening. No polite applause, no encouraging comments, just uncomfortable throat clearing and averted eyes. 2 weeks later, the rejection letter had arrived. Not just a polite decline, but a suggestion that perhaps Daniel should reconsider whether he had the temperament for professional performance. The rejection had been devastating, but what happened next had been worse. Word spread quickly through the small community college music department. Daniel Park, the prodigy everyone had believed in, had choked at the most important audition of his life. Some people had been sympathetic, offering condolences and encouragement. Others had been less kind, suggesting that perhaps Daniel had never been as talented as everyone thought, that his success had been luck rather than skill. The whispers and pitying looks had been unbearable. Daniel had tried to continue his studies, had attempted to rebuild his confidence and prepare for auditions the following year. But something fundamental had broken inside him. Every time he picked up his violin, his hands would start to shake. Every time he prepared for a performance, anxiety would overwhelm him. The instrument that had once been his voice, his passion, his identity, had become a source of terror. After 6 months of struggling, Daniel had made the decision to drop out. He had sold his expensive performance violin, the one his parents had saved for years to buy him, and had taken the first job he could find. The community college had been hiring night custodians. The irony of cleaning the building where he had once been celebrated as a star student was not lost on him. Daniel entered the rehearsal hall and began his cleaning routine. He swept the stage first, then moved methodically through the rows of seats, checking for trash and straightening the chairs. The work was mindless, which was exactly what he needed. It kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling too much on what he had lost. As he worked, Daniel could hear faint music coming from somewhere in the building. Someone was still practicing despite the late hour. The sound made his chest tighten with longing and regret. The melody was coming from one of the small practice rooms on the second floor. Daniel recognized the piece immediately. It was the Bach Chaconne, one of the most profound works ever written for solo violin. The student playing it was struggling, clearly not yet at the level required to tackle such demanding music. Notes were missed, the phrasing was awkward, and the emotional depth was completely absent. Daniel found himself mentally correcting the mistakes, his fingers unconsciously moving in the positions needed to play the passage correctly. He forced himself to stop listening and focus on his work. Thinking about music only made everything worse. It only reminded him of what he had given up, what he had failed to achieve. Daniel moved to the rehearsal hall storage room, where extra chairs and music stands were kept. As he opened the door, he froze. Sitting on a shelf, covered in dust, was a violin case. It looked old and forgotten, probably left behind by some student years ago and never claimed. Daniel knew he should ignore it, should close the door and move on with his cleaning duties. But something pulled him forward. He reached for the case with trembling hands and carefully lifted it down from the shelf. The latches were stiff from disuse, but they finally clicked open. Inside was a violin, not an expensive professional instrument, but a decent student model in surprisingly good condition. Someone had loved this instrument once, had cared for it properly. Daniel lifted the violin from its case and turned it over in his hands. The wood was warm to the touch, the varnish slightly worn in the places where a player's hand and chin would rest. A bow was also in the case, the horsehair still intact though probably in need of rehearing. Daniel looked around the empty storage room, making sure he was alone. Then, almost against his will, he tucked the violin under his chin. The feeling was instantly familiar, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. His left hand found the fingerboard, his right hand held the bow in the proper grip. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, frozen in the playing position, not making a sound. His heart was racing, his palms were sweating. Every instinct told him to put the violin down and walk away. Nothing good could come from this. But then, very slowly, Daniel drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged was rough and scratchy, the bow needing rosin and the strings needing tuning. But it was music. Real, tangible music produced by his own hands. Daniel adjusted the tuning pegs, bringing each string to the correct pitch. Then he played a simple scale, just a basic exercise he had learned as a child. His fingers were stiff and clumsy from 3 years of neglect, but the muscle memory was still there, buried beneath layers of fear and self-doubt. Daniel closed his eyes and let his hands remember what his mind had tried to forget. He played through scales and arpeggios, technical exercises that had once been as natural as breathing. The movements were awkward at first, his fingers not quite landing in the right places, his bow control shaky and uncertain. But gradually, incrementally, things began to click back into place. The space between his fingers found the correct distances for proper intonation. His bow arm relaxed into the fluid motion required for smooth sound production. It was like learning to walk again after a long illness, frustrating and exhausting but also exhilarating. Time disappeared as Daniel played. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He worked through progressively more difficult exercises, pushing his fingers to remember patterns they had not executed in years. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the physical exertion. His left hand began to ache from the unaccustomed pressure of pressing strings against the fingerboard. But Daniel did not stop. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than shame and regret. He felt alive. He felt like himself again. Daniel was so absorbed in playing that he did not hear the storage room door open. He did not notice the figure standing in the doorway, watching him with an expression of shock and recognition. It was only when a voice spoke that Daniel's eyes snapped open and his bow screeched to a halt. "Daniel Park?" Daniel spun around, his face flushing with embarrassment. Standing in the doorway was Professor Raymond Chen, the head of the music department and the man who had once been Daniel's primary violin instructor. Professor Chen was in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He wore his usual uniform of a cardigan sweater over a button-down shirt, leather patches on the elbows. He was holding a stack of sheet music and staring at Daniel with an expression of complete disbelief. "Professor Chen," Daniel stammered, quickly lowering the violin. I found this in the storage room and I was checking to see if it still worked. For inventory purposes." Professor Chen stepped into the room, setting his sheet music on a nearby shelf. His eyes moved from Daniel's face to the violin in his hands, then back again. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "You're working as a janitor here," Professor Chen said finally. It was not a question but a statement of fact, spoken with a mixture of sadness and disbelief. Daniel nodded, unable to meet the professor's eyes. "Yes, sir." "Night shift?" "I've been here for about 2 years now." 2 years, Professor Chen repeated. He shook his head slowly. "I had heard rumors that you were back in the building, but I did not believe them. I thought surely Daniel Park, the most talented student I had taught in 30 years, would not be cleaning toilets instead of performing in concert halls." The words stung because they carried no malice, only genuine bewilderment and disappointment. Daniel set the violin back in its case with shaking hands. "Things did not work out the way we planned," Daniel said quietly. "The Berkeley audition," I choked. "And after that, I could not seem to play anymore. Not the way I used to. So I dropped out." Professor Chen moved closer, his expression softening. "I know about the audition. I wrote you 3 letters afterward, trying to reach out, trying to help. You never responded to any of them." Daniel felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had received those letters, had read them multiple times before shoving them in a drawer and trying to forget about them. Professor Chen had offered encouragement, had suggested strategies for rebuilding confidence, had even offered to work with Daniel privately to prepare for future auditions. But Daniel had been too ashamed to respond, too convinced that he had permanently destroyed any chance at a musical career. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "I should have replied. I could not face anyone after what happened. Especially not you. You had believed in me so much, and I let you down." Professor Chen's expression hardened slightly. "You let yourself down, not me. Failure at one audition does not define your entire musical life, Daniel. Every great musician has faced rejection and setbacks. The difference between those who succeed and those who give up is resilience. The willingness to get back up after being knocked down." Daniel finally met Professor Chen's eyes. "It was not just one audition, Professor. It was everything that audition represented. I trained my entire childhood for that moment. My parents sacrificed so much to pay for lessons and competitions. Everyone at this school believed I was going to make it. And when I failed, I proved that I was not as good as everyone thought. I was just someone who got lucky for a while and then reality caught up." Professor Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying Daniel's face. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "What I just heard you playing a few minutes ago was not the work of someone without talent. Your technique is rusty, certainly. Your tone production needs work. But the fundamental musicianship is still there. The intonation, the phrasing, the understanding of the music, those things have not disappeared just because you stopped practicing. Daniel shook his head. You are being kind, Professor. But we both know that being decent at playing is not enough. Not in the professional music world. You need to be exceptional, and you need to be able to perform under pressure. I prove that I cannot do that. Professor Chen's jaw tightened, a sign Daniel recognized from his student days. It meant the professor was about to say something important, something Daniel needed to hear whether he wanted to or not. You know what your real problem is, Daniel? It is not lack of talent. It is not even performance anxiety, though you certainly developed that. Your problem is that you have convinced yourself of a false narrative. You have decided that one bad audition defines your entire worth as a musician. That is not just wrong, it is cowardly. The harsh words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Cowardly? Yes, cowardly, Professor Chen repeated. It is much easier to give up and blame it on fate or lack of ability than it is to face your fears and try again. You found a comfortable excuse to hide behind. You told yourself that you were not good enough, and then you made that belief a reality by stopping your training. But the truth is, you were scared. You are still scared. And instead of confronting that fear, you are mopping floors and pretending that you never wanted to be a musician in the first place. Daniel felt anger rising in his chest, hot and defensive. You do not understand what it was like. Standing on that stage, feeling my hands stop working, watching my entire future collapse in real time. The humiliation of knowing that everyone who believed in me was going to be disappointed. You cannot understand that unless you have lived through it. Professor Chen's expression softened again, but his voice remained firm. You are right that I have not experienced exactly what you went through. But I have seen dozens of talented students derailed by setbacks over my career. Some of them found their way back to music. Others, like you, decided it was easier to walk away. And do you know what the difference was? It was not talent. It was courage. The two men stood in silence, the tension between them thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Professor Chen reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. The spring recital is in 6 weeks, he said, handing the card to Daniel. Every year, we have a featured performance slot for alumni who want to showcase their continued musical development. I am inviting you to fill that slot this year. Daniel stared at the card without taking it. You cannot be serious. I am completely serious. You have 6 weeks to prepare a 20-minute recital. Choose any repertoire you want. Prove to yourself and everyone else that you are more than your worst moment. Daniel shook his head emphatically. No. Absolutely not. I have not performed in 3 years. I barely just picked up a violin again tonight for the first time. There's no way I could prepare a full recital in 6 weeks. Professor Chen placed the card on top of the violin case, forcing Daniel to acknowledge it. Then I suppose you will have to work harder than you have ever worked before. Unless, of course, you have decided that you are content being a janitor for the rest of your life. If that is the case, then continue as you are. But if there is any part of you that still wants to be a musician, if there is any part of you that still loves music the way you used to, then you will accept this challenge. And if I fail again? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. If I get up on that stage and choke just like I did at Berkeley? Then everyone will know for certain that I was never as good as they thought. At least now there is some ambiguity. People can wonder what might have been. If I try and fail publicly, there will be no doubt. Professor Chen's expression grew stern. So your plan is to preserve some mythical version of your past self by never attempting anything difficult again? That is not protection, Daniel. That is self-imposed imprisonment. The only way to truly fail is to never try at all. With those words, Professor Chen picked up his stack of sheet music and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back one final time. The offer stands for 48 hours. After that, I will find someone else to fill the performance slot. Think carefully about what you want your life to be." Then he was gone, leaving Daniel alone in the storage room with the dusty violin and the business card that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Daniel sank down onto a chair, his mind racing. 6 weeks to prepare a recital. It was impossible. He was out of shape, out of practice, and still paralyzed by the same anxiety that had derailed him 3 years ago. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to decline, to stay safe in his comfortable anonymity, to avoid the risk of public humiliation. But there was a small voice in the back of Daniel's mind, a voice he had been trying to suppress for 3 years. It was the voice of the young musician who had fallen in love with the violin at age 7. The voice that had practiced until his fingers bled because he loved the feeling of creating beautiful sound. The voice that had dreamed of playing in great concert halls and moving audiences to tears with his artistry. That voice was asking a simple question that Daniel could not ignore. What if you could do it? What if this was your chance to reclaim everything you lost? Daniel picked up the business card and read the details. Spring Alumni Recital, 6 weeks from today, 7 o'clock in the main rehearsal hall. The same hall where he had performed his triumphant senior recital 3 years ago. The same hall where he had once been celebrated as a rising star. The same hall where he now swept floors and emptied trash cans. Could he possibly stand on that stage again, not as a janitor but as a performer? Could he face the people who had witnessed his fall and show them that he was more than his worst moment? Daniel looked at the violin case, still open on the shelf beside him. The instrument seemed to be waiting patiently, asking him to make a choice. He could close the case, return it to the dusty shelf, and continue his life exactly as it was. Safe, predictable, free from the risk of failure or disappointment. Or he could pick up that violin and begin the terrifying, exhilarating process of becoming a musician again. The decision would determine not just the next 6 weeks, but potentially the entire trajectory of his future. Daniel sat in that storage room for a long time, wrestling with fear and hope, shame and possibility. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to his internal struggle. Somewhere in the building, a clock chimed midnight. A new day was beginning, and Daniel Park had to decide who he was going to be when the sun rose. He thought about his parents, immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to afford his violin. Lessons. He thought about all the teachers who had invested time and energy in developing his talent. He thought about the younger version of himself who had loved music with such pure, uncomplicated joy. Most of all, he thought about Professor Chen's words. Cowardly. The accusation stung because some part of Daniel recognized its truth. He had been hiding, using his past failure as an excuse to avoid the possibility of future failure. But in protecting himself from disappointment, he had also cut himself off from any possibility of success or fulfillment. Daniel stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing. He picked up the violin case and tucked Professor Chen's business card into his pocket. Then he walked out of the storage room, through the main rehearsal hall, and out of the music building into the cool night air. He had 48 hours to give Professor Chen an answer. But deep down, in a place he had not accessed in 3 years, Daniel already knew what his response would be. The question was not whether he would accept the challenge. The question was whether he had the courage to see it through. As Daniel walked across the empty campus toward the parking lot, he noticed that his hands were no longer shaking. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of shame and regret had lifted slightly. In its place was something Daniel had almost forgotten how to feel. It was fragile and terrifying, but it was real. It was hope. The recital hall filled with murmurs as audience members took their seats. Daniel stood backstage, violin in hand, fighting the urge to run. 6 weeks of brutal practice had led to this moment. His fingers were calloused again, his muscles remembered the patterns, but the fear remained as sharp as ever. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see familiar faces. Former classmates, teachers who had once praised him, people who remembered his spectacular failure 3 years ago. Professor Chen appeared beside him, his expression unreadable. "Last chance to back out," he said quietly. Daniel almost laughed. After everything he had endured these past weeks, after confronting every demon that had haunted him, backing out now would make all that suffering meaningless. "I'm ready," Daniel said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. The professor nodded once, then walked through the curtain to address the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a very special performance. 3 years ago, one of our most gifted students faced a setback that many would consider insurmountable. Tonight, he returns to this stage to prove that true artistry cannot be defeated by a single moment of failure. Please welcome Daniel Park." The curtain opened. Daniel walked onto the stage, and the applause was polite but uncertain. He could feel the questions in the room. Why was the janitor holding a violin? What could he possibly have to offer after years of absence? Daniel reached the center of the stage and bowed, then positioned himself with the instrument under his chin. His opening piece was deliberate, a statement of intent. He had chosen the same Paganini caprice that had destroyed him at Berkeley. Not because he wanted to relive that trauma, but because he needed to prove he could conquer it. The first notes emerged clean and precise. Daniel's bow moved across the strings with control he had fought desperately to rebuild. The technical passages that had once seemed impossible now flowed with hard-won fluency. But Daniel was not just executing notes anymore. 6 weeks of practice had taught him something crucial. Perfection was not the goal. Communication was. Every phrase carried the weight of his journey, the pain of his fall, the slow climb back toward the light. The audience began to shift forward in their seats. This was not the performance of someone merely competent. This was the work of someone who had suffered and emerged with deeper understanding. Daniel poured 3 years of anguish into the music, but also 3 years of growth. The shame of failure, the humility of menial work, the courage required to stand on this stage again, all of it channeled through his instrument. As Daniel moved through the most technically demanding section, the passage where his hand had cramped years ago, he felt the familiar flutter of panic. His fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second. But instead of seizing up, instead of letting fear take control, Daniel breathed through it. He had learned in these 6 weeks that mistakes were not catastrophes. They were simply moments to navigate and move past. His fingers found their positions, the passage continued, and the moment of danger passed. The piece concluded with a flourish of rapid notes ascending toward the highest register of the instrument. Daniel's bow lifted from the strings on the final note, and for a heartbeat, silence filled the hall. Then the applause erupted, genuine and enthusiastic. But Daniel barely heard it. He was already preparing for his next selection, the piece that would truly reveal who he had become. "For my second piece," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I will perform an original composition. I wrote it during these past 6 weeks, and I call it Redemption in C minor." He saw Professor Chen's eyebrows raise in surprise. Daniel had not told him about this. The original plan had been to perform only established repertoire. But during his practice sessions, melodies had begun forming in Daniel's mind, phrases that expressed what words could not. He had spent hours writing them down, shaping them, refining them into a coherent work. The composition began softly, almost tentatively, like someone testing their voice after years of silence. The melody was simple at first, searching and uncertain. It represented Daniel on that first night in the storage room, afraid to even touch the instrument. But gradually, the music gained confidence. The harmonies grew richer, the rhythms more complex. The piece told the story of struggle and perseverance, of falling and rising again. There was a section in the middle that turned harsh and dissonant, representing the darkest moments of Daniel's 3 years in exile. The violin screamed with frustration and self-loathing, the bow pressed hard against the strings producing sounds that bordered on painful. Some audience members winced, but they remained transfixed. This was raw emotion made audible, truth without pretense. Then, slowly, the dissonance resolved. The melody that had opened the piece returned, but transformed. What had been tentative was now assured. What had been questioning was now declarative. The music swelled toward a climax that spoke not of triumphant victory, but of hard-won acceptance. Daniel was not trying to erase his failure or pretend it had never happened. He was acknowledging it, integrating it, using it as the foundation for something new. As the final chord faded, Daniel lowered his violin and looked out at the audience. Many were crying openly. Others sat stunned, still processing what they had just witnessed. Professor Chen was standing, his hands pressed together in front of his face, his eyes bright with emotion. Then he began to applaud, and the entire hall rose to join him. The standing ovation continued for several minutes. Daniel stood motionless, overwhelmed by the response. This was so different from the polite applause he had received after technically perfect but emotionally hollow performances in his student days. This applause was for something authentic, something that had cost him everything to create. When the applause finally subsided and the audience began to file out, many people approached Daniel. Former classmates embraced him, teachers shook his hand with genuine warmth, strangers thanked him for the courage of his performance. One elderly woman gripped his arm tightly and said, "Young man, I have attended these recitals for 20 years. That was the most honest performance I have ever witnessed." But the encounter that mattered most came last. Professor Chen waited until the hall had emptied before approaching Daniel. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other, years of complicated history passing between them. "You exceeded every expectation I had," Professor Chen said finally. "Not because of your technical ability, though that has clearly returned. But because you showed us something rare. You showed us a musician who has truly lived, who has suffered and grown, and who can transform that experience into art." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I almost did not come tonight. Even after 6 weeks of preparation, I almost walked away at the last minute. But you did not. And that makes all the difference." Professor Chen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This arrived at my office yesterday. I was going to give it to you after the performance, but I wanted to see if you could do this first." He handed the envelope to Daniel, who opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter from the Eastridge Conservatory, one of the top music schools in the region. The letter offered Daniel a full scholarship for their graduate performance program, contingent on a successful audition. At the bottom was a handwritten note from the director of admissions. "Professor Chen sent us recordings of your recent practice sessions. We would be honored to hear you audition. We believe that musicians with your depth of experience and artistic maturity are exactly what the professional world needs." Daniel stared at the letter, unable to process what he was reading. "You recorded my practice sessions?" Professor Chen smiled slightly. "I may have left a recording device in that storage room after our first conversation. I wanted documentation of your progress, and I wanted to be able to show people what you were capable of achieving. I hope you are not angry." "Angry?" Daniel laughed, a sound that came out half-sob. "Professor, you gave me back my life. How could I possibly be angry? I did not give you anything. You did the work. You faced your fears. You chose to try again when it would have been easier to stay hidden. All I did was provide an opportunity." Professor Chen placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "The question now is what you will do next. Will you audition for Eastridge? Will you pursue music seriously again?" Daniel looked down at the violin in his hands, the same dusty student instrument he had found in the storage room 6 weeks ago. It was not a valuable instrument by any measure, but it had become precious to him. It represented the possibility of transformation, the chance to rebuild what had been broken. "Yes," Daniel said quietly. "I will audition. And whatever happens, I will keep playing. Not because I need to prove anything to anyone else, but because I cannot imagine living without music anymore. These past 6 weeks reminded me that playing is not just what I do. It is who I am." Professor Chen nodded, satisfied. "That is the correct answer. Talent will only take you so far in this profession. But passion, genuine love for the art, that will sustain you through every challenge you face." As Daniel left the recital hall that night, he paused at the trophy case in the hallway. His photograph from 3 years ago still hung there, that confident young man who had not yet learned what failure tasted like. Daniel studied the image for a long moment, then smiled. He was not that person anymore, and he was grateful for it. That Daniel had been talented but untested, confident but shallow. The new Daniel, the one who had spent years in the wilderness, carried scars that would never fully heal. But he also carried wisdom and depth that only suffering could teach. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the lobby of Eastridge Conservatory, waiting for his audition to be called. His hands were sweating, his heart was racing, and every old anxiety was whispering that he would fail again. But this time, Daniel had tools to manage the fear. He had learned that nervousness was not his enemy, just an indicator that he cared deeply about what he was doing. He had learned that mistakes were survivable, that one bad moment did not define his entire worth. Most importantly, he had learned that the only true failure was allowing fear to silence him. When his name was called, Daniel walked into the audition room with his head high. The panel of judges looked up expectantly. Daniel tucked his violin under his chin, took one deep breath, and began to play. The music that emerged was not perfect. There were small technical flaws that a harsh critic might identify. But the performance had something far more important than perfection. It had truth. It had the sound of someone who had journeyed to the edge of despair and found their way back. It had the voice of a musician who finally understood that the goal was not to be flawless, but to be real. When Daniel finished, one of the judges wiped her eyes and said simply, "Welcome to Eastridge." 2 years after that audition, Daniel Park stood on the stage of a small concert hall in the city, preparing for his graduate recital. The audience was modest, maybe 100 people, but among them sat his parents, Professor Chen, and several of the janitors he had worked alongside during his years in exile. Daniel had invited them specifically because they had seen him at his lowest and deserved to witness his redemption. The program was ambitious, featuring works by Bach, Brahms, and Bartók. But the centerpiece was an expanded version of the composition Daniel had premiered at the alumni recital, Redemption in C minor. He had spent 2 years refining it, deepening its emotional complexity, shaping it into something that could stand alongside the masterworks of the violin repertoire. As Daniel played that night, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The spectacular failure, the years of shame, the courage to try again, the slow rebuilding of skill and confidence. Every experience, good and bad, had shaped the musician he had become. The music he created now carried the weight of lived experience, the understanding that came from having lost everything and clawed his way back. After the recital, as audience members approached to offer congratulations, Daniel spotted a young woman lingering at the back of the hall. She looked nervous, clutching a violin case to her chest. Daniel recognized the expression immediately. It was the look of someone who loved music but had been wounded by it, who wanted to play but was paralyzed by fear. Daniel walked over to her. "I saw you during the performance. You are a violinist." The young woman nodded. "I was. I had to stop playing 2 years ago after a bad competition experience. I have been too afraid to try again. But tonight, hearing your music, I felt something shift. Like maybe it is not too late for me." Daniel smiled, feeling a sense of purpose settle over him. His journey had not just been about personal redemption. It had been about learning lessons that could help others facing similar struggles. "It is never too late," he said. "The path back is hard, but it is possible. If you want help, I would be honored to work with you." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "Really? You would do that?" "Of course. Someone did it for me when I needed it most. Now it is my turn to pay that forward." Daniel pulled out a business card with his contact information and handed it to her. "Call me next week. We will start slowly, rebuild your confidence step by step. I promise you, the music is still inside you, waiting to come back out." As the young woman walked away clutching the card like a lifeline, Professor Chen approached. "Starting your own rehabilitation program?" he asked with a knowing smile. "Maybe," Daniel said. "I keep thinking about all the talented musicians who give up because of one bad experience. If my story can help even a few of them find their way back, then everything I went through will have been worth it." Professor Chen nodded approvingly. "That is the mark of true artistry, Daniel. Using your gifts not just for personal glory, but to lift others up. Your father would have been proud." the mention of his father made Daniel pause. He had not spoken much about his family during his years of struggle. But now he felt ready to share. My father was a factory worker who never had the chance to study music. But he loved it deeply. When I was a child, he would play recordings of great violinists and tell me that music was the closest thing to magic that humans could create. He died during my second year of college, just before everything fell apart. I did not know, Professor Chen said softly. I am sorry. For a long time, I felt like I had dishonored his memory by failing and giving up. But I realize now that the real dishonor would have been staying silent, never trying again. My father believed that music could transform lives. Tonight, I finally proved he was right. As Daniel packed up his violin and prepared to leave the concert hall, he took one last look at the stage where he had just performed. 3 years ago, standing on a different stage, he had experienced his worst nightmare. Tonight, on this stage, he had experienced something equally powerful but infinitely more meaningful. He had not erased his failure or pretended it never happened. He had integrated it, learned from it, and used it to become a more complete artist and human being. The road ahead was still uncertain. Daniel had no illusions about the difficulty of building a career as a professional musician. There would be more rejections, more setbacks, more moments of doubt. But he was no longer the fragile young musician who would shatter at the first sign of trouble. He had been broken and rebuilt, and in the process, he had become stronger than he ever could have been without the struggle. As Daniel walked out into the cool evening air, violin case in hand, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had reclaimed his identity as a musician, but more importantly, he had discovered who he truly was beneath the accolades and achievements. He was someone who could fall and rise again, who could face his fears and emerge victorious, who could transform pain into beauty. And that, Daniel realized, was worth more than any trophy or credential could ever be. The janitor had become a musician again. But more than that, the broken young man had become whole. And his story, played out in notes and phrases and carefully constructed melodies, would continue to resonate long after the final chord had faded into silence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.